If a brand wanted to pitch the Majority Group, what would be the best way for them to approach you?
Think of what your direct ask is.
What do you think are some challenges on social that are like deeply specific to fashion brands?
Mainstream brands aren't building to actually serve the audience. They have a number to hit and a quota to hit, so they're going to see what's commercial.
We're moving away from just looking at a size. I mean, I will buy like a 5X. It totally depends on the fit and the cut and everything. So
Vibes.
Yeah.
Like, why isn't there a filter option for like vibe level?
That's genius. There should be. Today on Deep Feed, I chat with Lola Catero, the founder of the Majority Group, a team that is focused on shifting purchasing power to brands that are evolving the style status quo. The Majority Group is particularly interested in brands that are building within their values and vision to better represent the diverse and complex way in which people today actually explore style and aesthetics. The Majority Group supports these brands by spotlighting them on their podcast, Style as Identity, writing checks through the Majority Group Investment Syndicate, and providing advisory and mentorship. Let's get into it. Hi, Lola. Welcome to Deep Feed.
Hey, Winter. How are you?
Good. So I'd love to start with kind of just getting that foundational background. And can you tell us a bit about yourself and what is it that you do at the Majority Group?
Yeah, great question. I guess we could say that my threads of passion have been linear, but my journey to getting there has been a little winding. I always knew I was into fashion and business and, starting little businesses up in high school, selling t-shirts and stuff like that. And when it came time to go to college, I was like, do I go for fashion? Do I go for business? And ultimately selected business and then could weave into, a specific industry. And then ended up that was in New York, went to grad school in SF for entrepreneurship, and that's kind of where the winding started a little bit. SF's a one industry town. But I'll just never forget this one class where this guy came in and, it wasn't that long ago, but it was long enough ago. Tech changes really fast where the industry had a need and was responding to selling software to consumers and users by actually articulating the benefits as opposed to feature function geek speak. And this guy built a whole business off of helping software companies evolve their go-to-market strategy to actually speak to the benefits. And at the time, it was a thriving business. That was the need. I had never heard anyone talk about marketing in this way. And I was shook. I was like, what? He went over his whole methodology. And I was lucky enough, he was hiring and my teacher recommended me to go work for him. And then that's where I met my mentor. And I feel like I really learned the foundational aspects of marketing through him and was my bedrock through. I went to 3 separate companies with him, and that turned into a decade-long career spanning social mobile apps, enterprise software, you name it, the kind of industry or size, and got to kind of flex those skills and apply them to those different audiences or users. And it was fascinating. But then I started to get frustrating at work, and I reflected. I was like, oh, it's not the people, it's not the company, the product necessarily, but I'm not doing what makes me feel fulfilled. So after that little internal reflection, that's when I started to realize oh, my spare time, I love shopping. I'm constantly doing all this research to make sure, if it's who's making these clothes, what does it look like? First, is the aesthetic match mine? But then also going deeper into that. And I love doing all that work. And I realized, I need to get back to these things that I just default to in my downtime and that I am driven so towards. That kind of in contrast with the world around me. It is really clear that at least the tech industry wasn't built for me or who it was built for, and then everybody else.
Definitely.
It all this news was around of minority majority crossover by whatever, but you look around and you're oh, but that's not what I'm seeing day to day. And so I decided to begin my pivot. I quit my job. I started to build V1 of what the Majority Group is today. It was a website that featured 50 brands that I really loved, but you could filter those brands by founder type. At the time, you could go to websites for female-founded brands or Black-owned brands, and those are essential websites and companies. But there was nothing that was like, hey, what about everybody? And if you wanted to filter by a certain founder type, you could. And so that was kind of the first iteration that also quickly evolved into sustainability and, understanding like what that brand represents or their way into their definition of sustainability, all that stuff. Anyway, that was my first like foray into that. And then also I moved to Mexico City, helped a brand expand into the US. And that's where I took my marketing skills. And I was like, okay, I spent like a decade in this industry. What's transferable? What is actually my secret sauce that I can bring to the fashion world or like physical products? And then what do I need to like level up and learn? So I consulted a bit, then moved back to New York and worked with brands here. And that's what turned into V2 and now the current iteration of the Majority Group, which is a podcast investment group advisory and several other things. But those are our three main arms today.
Yeah. So yeah, the transformation of the Majority Group is really interesting to me. How did you make the decision to kind of go from this database of brands to like really, I mean, that's a big change. What happened there that made you rethink the model of the Majority Group to have it be what it is today?
Yeah. Right after the kind of database of sorts, we added the blog feature, which is interviewing brands in like text-based form. But it's a good question, and that was launched in 2017, so it's been several years.
Mm-hmm.
And during that time, I kept being like, "Oh, I'm moving slow, but I don't know what the next step is." And the like approach I took was, "What am I good at doing? Like, what can I really deliver on, and something that is impactful? What do I like doing? And then what does the world respond to? Like, what do they need? What do they want?" And started to circumvent a few options there. Like one potential, I think a natural default would be like, oh, why don't you make an e-com site that features these brands and then, like you can actually sell them. But I was like, I don't really want to build that. Like that's not going to wake me up every morning. And didn't feel like the right alignment of my skill sets. But I think some people have built versions of that, but like that was like kind of an example that I was like, is this right for us? Yes or no? And so what it is today are the things that answer those kind of three buckets.
Right. So you have the investment group where you're actually putting money into brands, the podcast, and then an advisory arm for brands.
Yeah.
What kind of brands do you look for? Because I love the tagline that you have, evolving the style status quo. So what does that tagline mean, and how does that inform the kinds of brands that you're working with?
Yeah. So at baseline, it's like brands that are mixing it up, I mean, like, what do we see every day? Who's making it? And I think that our work is to evolve the notion of what we should expect from the brands that are making the clothes we wear. We put these things on every day. They are an extension of ourselves. And so what standards have we set for them? And what are we not even aware that we should be expecting from them? And so evolving the style status quo is that exploration and surfacing of these brands. It feeds into our legacy, our hopeful legacy that we're always striving to hit, is to shift purchasing dollars into brands that better represent us. And so these kind of three buckets that we spend most of our time on, the Majority Group Investment Syndicate is helping to put actual dollars into the brands that we want to see win. So like helping to shift the industry portfolio of brands. Then the podcast is to take those brands and really say like, what are those trade-offs to building what you're building, and like how can we see more of it to hopefully give hope to people in the industry or future designers, then also just like surface the realities that it is possible, but then kind of get into the nitty-gritty that makes it possible, and then advisory and mentoring to like help support that.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. When it comes to working with brands that are, value driven and are representing in certain ways, something resonated with me from your website that said, mainstream fashion brands that dominate our stores and our screens often don't design within their values or vision. They design for trends and sales. You go on to say how often you don't feel seen or represented by big brands, and that's a big part of like the mission statement of the Majority Group. So I'm curious what you're really searching for when it comes to that representation.
Yeah. Okay, I'll start with a UX answer. The first part is like, they say gender is a drag. I'm doing like double work going into the men's section, the women's section. Like, what does that look like? So, very baseline for me personally. It is laborious to go through, and I just want to see what the brand is putting out. So that's like my personal qualm with it. I'm also shopping for or curating options for my kid, and who's very particular, and I'm doing double time there. So I feel like I'm not an edge case. I think that this is something that if we were to remove the filters of gender on websites, I don't think that we need that as prolifically as we do. I think consumers would respond positively. But that's something that's my personal like qualm. And I'm curious, like, why is it that way? What are like historical aspects of fashion that led us to where we are? How difficult is it to change that standardization of sizing and all this kind of stuff? It's, one thing for me as a user to have that desire, but then really getting to learn all the things that have to be undone from a process and industry norm perspective. That stuff kind of fascinates me, because then you go from just like kind of being a complaining consumer that doesn't feel seen to like, all right, what does need to change? And should we push on that? So that's like one slight thing, but I think, we have a whole theme in my podcast about sizing and like what's the difference between size and fit, and how well does it serve us on websites when things emphasize size so much. And sure, that's useful. It's a standardization that we can reference and kind of know, but how well does that really serve us? I like pushing back on that conceptually, but also in my own shopping. So if someone were to ask what size I am, I'd be like, well, what's the garment? And then let's talk. So those are like just a few examples that are interesting to me, that could be shifted.
Yeah, definitely. Do you think like those are in terms of the portfolio now at the Majority Group, is that like a common denominator across the brands that are in the investment syndicate, or like in terms of diversity, like how are the brands in the portfolio like pushing for that representation?
I don't just focus on that aspect, which would be good because that's pretty narrow. But it's more of that broader concept of like, does this serve the audience? And I think back to your original question of like, mainstream brands aren't building to actually serve the audience. They have a number to hit and a quota hit, so they're going to see what's commercial. There is value in that. You want to make sure you're going to make things that sell, but like going back to the user benefits, what is their need? Argent is a great suit example. Women's wear suiting, or just suiting in general. They make suits with pockets, and that is still novel, a lot of years later after they started, and that's wild. And they are thinking with the end user in mind, saying, oh, traditionally women's suiting doesn't have pockets, but like she needs to put her tampon somewhere, like whatever. Like we have wallets too now. We're allowed to have that. And so where do we put those things? So we look at any brand that are really building with the consumer in mind, and pushing on what they should be expecting from the brands that serve them.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I love that. Yeah, and I think as consumers too, we're moving away from just looking at a size. I mean, I will buy like a 5X. It totally depends on the fit and the cut and everything. So
vibes.
vibes.
Yeah. Like, why isn't there a filter option for like vibe level?
That's genius. There should be. Well, I'm curious what it takes for, in addition to like to being driven by what the consumer wants or needs or might be open to, like what what does the majority group look for to invest in a brand, whether that's financial or advisory or even inviting,
Yeah.
to have an interview on the podcast? Like what characteristics of a brand make it worthy of that investment?
Yeah. I think you totally nailed it when you started to expand on the definition of investment. And that's exactly what our approach is. We are taught to prioritize the definition of investment that focuses on financial. And it is more expansive than that, right? Like we invest our time, our energy, our labor, our headspace, and as people. And so when we look at investment, we do have the financial arm, but we also, the podcast, it's invite only, but it's free for the brands. We take on all the labor and cost to produce it. And so we're like very selective in who we are spending our time and energy in discussing these topics with. And same thing with the advisory group. So we view investing in general as a way to help further and achieve that ultimate legacy. And then to answer about like financially investing in brands, we kind of view the podcast as a pipeline to potential investment, and whether that is financial or even just advisory and mentorship. The investment syndicate actually came about because in season one of the brands we interviewed was going through a round of funding. And that's when we were like, oh, wait, we should like explore this. There could be something here. I mean, the podcast, as you know, it's like there's a whole level of research and due diligence that happens. And so we get to know these brands on a more intimate level and have these founder conversations. So then when it comes time for them to be raising, that first pass, that initial pass of that is complete. So we view it a bit as a pipeline to future investment. That said, we have invested in brands outside the podcast and outside of fashion because, we need a diverse portfolio here. But it does lean on fashion brands and the podcast as a pipeline.
Definitely. When it comes to kind of like writing a check, which, obviously it's a multi-prong investment strategy at the Majority Group, but what are the main pain points of brands when they come and they're like, we need money? Obviously, every brand needs money. We know that, but like, if you look at a brand, what makes you go, you may actually not need like a check right now, like you might need something else. Like, what is your kind of initial approach when it comes to like how you want to work with a brand?
Yeah. I'd say default, we definitely do follow the traditional like questions of investments. So like product founder fit, is that right? All that kind of stuff. So you could Google that, and those things that's like what we focus on, but to us, that's actually table stakes. Founder product fit, what is the industry they're in? How crowded is it? What is their offering? Does this make sense? Are they ready for this product in the world? Like some people might be, too far ahead, so the investment now wouldn't be the best allocation, all that kind of stuff. So if you Google that, that's our first step. But to us, that's the first step. Then we also ask ourselves, like, fit, then fruition. How much do we feel that this needs to be in the world, and how can we best support them? And so the way our process is I'm like general partner, right? So I get the deal opportunity, and then I go through and I answer some of these questions, and then I pass it to the people in the syndicate and say, hey, like, are you interested in exploring this further? And then we set up some meetings to continue the research and diligence. And that's when, people have their own reasons for investing also. And so they answer that for themselves. And if there's enough interest to either hit the minimum check or exceed, then we continue down the process. So I kind of act as, I think, like the shepherd or guide, like whatever you want to say. And so I kind of take that first pass, and then I perceive myself as just one of the investment members, and then ultimately decide for myself if I want to participate or not. And people have different reasons for that, and people have different connections. So that's a little bit about our process there.
Yeah, that's awesome. In terms of the advisory and mentorship aspect, where you're providing like that tactical advice on marketing and business,
Yeah.
like what are some examples of the kinds of advice you're providing, like based on the challenges of the brands that you're talking to?
Yeah. And so some brands we naturally kind of fall into advisory mentorship. Some come to us first being like, can I get a check? And it's not like the right allocation at that time. Sure. Well, all brands would be like, yeah, like checks are the best. Sometimes that's actually not, if you're needing help to launch your fall winter 24 collection, is money going to help you get that end result, or is it skills and support and mentorship or guidance? And so that's kind of the lens through which we look at it. And we find that the best like fit for us are people that are like designers at their core, or maybe product at their core, but don't have a background in business or marketing. I mean, most of these people went to RISD or IFM or, FIT or Parsons, and they had to make trade-offs of, do you want to take a class on sustainability or business? And it's
Right.
like, well, shoot, both of those. But, you can't take all the classes. And so we really try to like fill in where they're focused on designing. And so how can we help them launch that campaign? And so we work on a multitude of things, but a lot of it's rooted in go-to-market strategy for brands about to launch, recently launched brands between like, a year and 4 years old, on aligning that consumer benefit to their go-to-market strategy, and that it also informs product. One recent example that seems to be a theme lately is how well does the brand know their consumer? And it's a little bit of like a hypothesis, like, I think it's this type of person. And then we go back and I'm like, let's do some interviews. Let's get the people that like the customers with the highest LTV. So the people that have spent the most on your product, the people that purchased more than once, or so returning customers. And so we kind of consolidate those people that are also likely to be bigger fans of the brand and have high likelihood to respond to our emails, like, hey, can we chat? And then we ask them questions like, we want to learn about you and we want to keep building for you. So we'd love to like dig in. And people often find that flattering, which is great because we want them to feel flattered. We're so like thankful for them. And we do user interviews about half-hour long to dig into their lifestyle. And that then we say, what are themes? What can we make sure comes through in the product, the next collection, in the go-to-market strategy, in the imagery that we use when we launch? Like, are they looking for some more staple items that they know they can ride with on the subway, but then also go to like a cute book reading at night? I don't know. And so then how does that manifest into the copy, the creative, the language? And so they feel seen not only by the original reason that they bought into the brand, but also help them like envision, oh, that I can use that for this. So we've been working on that a lot lately across several of the brands.
Yeah, I love that. I think people underestimate the value of actually talking to your customer.
Yeah.
And taking the time to actually like get on calls with them.
Yeah.
Do you think that's is that like the recurring biggest challenge you're seeing, is like the brand may not even be aware that they don't really know their customer?
Yeah.
Like, does the founder come to you and they're just like, my sales are low, like I don't know why?
Yeah.
And you kind of have to like just look at everything going on, and you see where the gaps in the knowledge are.
All right, before I answer that, I would love to shout out a brand out of Brooklyn, Naomi Nomi. I asked her one time, I was like, do you know your customer? Because this was a theme for a lot of the ones we're advising. And I was like, is everybody not know? And she was like, I manically Google who buys our product. And it's like really clear in our discussions that she does know. She's like, our customer is I think like millennials and their moms, or millennials and their mentors. And, they still have defining that within there, but it's so clear. And then a way that successfully drives results is There's one model that they use in a lot of their imagery, and they've put money and spend behind some of those photographs, and it drives sales. And I think it's because it so directly responds to the people that she knows is their customer, because she's like, who bought this? What did they buy? Where do they live? Oh, they bought 6 of these shirts because they're a lawyer, like going in. And so I think if you're a brand out there and you aren't as neurotic as that, like maybe you should be, because it just, I think that groundwork makes everything from there so much easier. And so back to answer your question, I think sometimes when brands come to us and they have open questions of, oh, I need more sales, or I want to drive more D2C sales, right? Like retailers and people are expanding into omni-channel retailer for a lot of reasons, right? So people used to kind of go back to D2C and like kind of say no to retailers. And now it's a way to offset acquisition costs for bringing people to your own website and help with marketing by being in, Bloomingdale's or Shopbop or whatever. But it's also really tricky because they also take a cut. And so there's this like desire for a healthier mix of D2C sales versus wholesale. And I think, outside of fashion, people can relate to this. Also, there's also a loss of first party data at times when you do, even if you're a CPG brand selling on Amazon, like you don't get that customer data. And that's the name of the game for getting the returning customers. Anyway, people want to know their customer and they also want to achieve their sales. And when they can't answer, like, what should I focus on from a marketing perspective? That's when I'm like, oh, that means we don't know enough about the person buying this to help dictate that. And so that's kind of like peeling back the onion to see where should we start, do that groundwork that kind of takes a minute to do. But then after that, you're like, oh, I know the next 3 campaigns. I know the things we should focus on. Like you could basically build your year calendar from that work.
Yeah, that's amazing. What do you see as most successful in marketing for brands, like especially after you consult with them and they take that advice and they go to market? Like, what are you seeing is actually working? And you can get as detailed as you want with that in terms of like the actual kinds of content being posted on social, which platforms, like do they report back and tell you like, wow, like this campaign that took form as a UGC campaign, or, like what is working and what's not working too?
Yeah. Okay, that's a meaty question. I think like there's like, let's acknowledge how hard it is for brands right now. I mean, it's like social media is both a content engine to like drive awareness of your brand, but then it's also a store. There's new features every day. So I think if we're even going to narrow that down to like, how can social media serve a brand? That's a huge question. And I think what we're getting down to is a brand saying to themselves, where am I going to invest my time and resources to have the highest likelihood to meet and engage this person? And so I take a step back and say, where is your person most likely to be and why are they there? And then how can you show up for them and like answer that for them? And that'll be your biggest bet into driving that purchase, but it'd also be like your most efficient way to do that because you're responding to their behavior, but giving them something only you can give them because you're a brand with distinct value proposition and things that you give. So that's like, that's not very tactical. That's very high level. But if I'm thinking, hey, should we be on TikTok? And it's like, well, what's your goal there? What are you going to say that's different? And yeah, like your audience is there, but do you have the time and resources to come up with that strategy? And if you do, that's sick. Like, let's keep going with that. But let's be realistic about like how much time you have. I think my top line answer would be like, yeah, you should absolutely be on TikTok, but let's make sure we're spending that time responsibly of like driving that thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's hard for brands, especially small brands with small teams, to be on every single platform. And that's something we, work with our brands at Posture and also just see in the wild of everyone being like, how do you know which platforms to be on? And like, how many resources you need to allocate per platform, because people underestimate the time and expertise it takes to create content that actually drives engagement and like works.
I wonder what your rec there is. So mine, and I also work with multi-million dollar brands, and they are always testing that marketing mix and resources. So it's not something that if brands are like feeling like, shoot, I haven't figured this out. It's like everyone's asking themselves that question every day and every quarter. So it's an evolving answer. But I like to think of it of if you can do quick tests that help you identify what might stick and what feels true, like that's a great place to start and then go all in. So that's like one aspect to it. And then the other is, yeah, doing that deeper dive on, what's going to be your, like, what's one thing you can start with to see how well it resonates and commit long enough, like have a testing structure of like, we are going to do this. We're going to have the results in 2 weeks or like at least some early indicators. We're going to use likes or shares as definition of success or to get that benchmark, and then really lean on those numbers to say, hey, is this worth continuing investment, whatever investment looks like for the brand. Yeah,
that's definitely what we would, along the lines of what we would recommend too, is like if we don't have a big team and a big budget, or a founder who wants to show up and create content, or a budget to hire creators, because I think what we're seeing is brands really have to function as a creator. Like they need to take that inspiration, right? And what's working on the platform is entertainment, education, humor, like even just a lot of value. So definitely thinking about like if you are investing in even like an in-house full-time creator for the brand, like starting with a short test to see if that's working before like going all in is exactly like what we would suggest for sure.
Yeah. And then a little outside of social media, I've had this experience twice now with brands where they had been, they're, fairly early brands. So people are going on their Instagram and seeing all these different products and stuff, but some might have been from past collections or whatever. And they're getting these DMs of like, oh, do you still have that in red or whatever? And on one hand, that can be frustrating for a brand that's, everyone's like, you need newness. But then people are like, wait, what about that old one? And in both instances that this came up, we were like, actually, this is another arm of your business. Like, can you actually scale people wanting iterations of this and then frame it as a custom outfit or an atelier? And because in both instances, sometimes they would go down that road and then people would kind of ghost them. And we're like, let's add a little structure to this. Let's add a page on your website that's like custom orders. They start at this price point. So this is it. And this is the process. So then you get people, intentional buyers through that. And then now you have this whole arm of a new business offering that was actually built on customer desire. They raised their hand and you're like, oh, this doesn't actually shift my business in a big way that takes a lot of resources from me. It actually just is a little structure and a web page and, maybe some other stuff. But like, I think looking for those opportunities to explore, but then they respond to consumer need. Those are ones to not ignore too.
No, definitely. What are some ways you recommend like brands getting that kind of engagement and feedback? Like how can you, there's the like direct messaging people or like contacting customers, but like through even like just organic and paid social, like how can brands increase engagement and get, obviously driving sales, but just to get people commenting, telling you like, oh, I wish you had this, or I wish, this was a thing you offered.
Yeah, that one I feel like is like a test and see, because in a few of those instances, even on our own Instagram, those were often people that raised their hand. And so they came to us. And so if someone's telling you something, asking you a question, or even maybe giving you critical feedback, then instead of being like, ugh, that's annoying, why don't they just realize like buy, like if it's on the website or like something, instead you're like, oh, what are they actually saying? And can we fulfill that? Like, is that an opportunity for us? So I think brands just being open to the people that are coming to them that are like, that takes a lot to come to a brand. So that's first and foremost. But then the other one is, testing it out, like new collections coming, this color, this color. That stuff is cute and can like help, I think, day-to-day engagement and keep people interested. But the more a brand can go deeper into like something that would actually bring joy to the person is where you're going to get those kind of nuggets, if that makes sense. And having fun with it. To bring up Naomi Nomi again, I think she does such a good job because she knows her customer of making these almost Instagram stories that look highly produced and curated, because they are. But if you look closely and follow her long enough, you're like, oh, this is a template. So they spent the time, made a gorgeous template, and now they swap out colors or they swap out whatever. And that decreases time to creation, which we don't have a lot of time. And then the part that is a through thread is the brand tone. It's so aligned with having a personality, but being real with the customer, but also being entertaining. And then that way, when they try to engage with their audience, they're getting responses because it feels like, oh, this brand is aspirational. It has what I need. But then I also kind of feel like I know them because of the way that the tone has been cultivated and, respond. And so they feel that they can relate to it.
Yeah. When, let's say there's a new brand, a startup launching, and they obviously need money, they want to drive sales. Do you think as a startup, like your priority should be sales or should it be brand awareness or a combination?
Well, good question. We'd love to say both. I think it would be a mix, and it depends on what channels. And I also think at what stage of launch. I think there is something to be thought of using marketing, especially if you're like any product, fashion, whatever. It's not like you launch the product and then marketing is the release. Marketing is the launch. And so if you think about when this thing is actually available and then when you're promoting it, those are the two juncture points to pay the most attention to. I think often we focus so much on the production of that item, and then from that trickles down what like marketing is. Oh, and then how do we do this? It's like, okay, let's talk about those kind of in tandem at the same time. And then that way, maybe you're actually building up awareness before the product even launches. In the tech world, one tactic used to be to tease out something before it was built and make an email waitlist to garner that attraction. And then so when you were ultimately going to get customers or even get investment, you can show that KPI of like, we have X quantity, like a million person waitlist to launch this thing. And well, take that and apply it to your own business. So how do you drum up that awareness and that like desire for this product ahead of time? Then absolutely make sure the product delivers on that. Like, don't overhype the thing, like be really true to that.
Yeah.
But I would say at the launch, drive sales and awareness. But before the launch, work on awareness as much as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that makes sense. What do you think are some challenges on social that are like deeply specific to fashion brands?
There's a lot of challenges on social.
It's challenging for everyone across the board, but are there some things that are like for fashion specific?
Yeah. I think there's like a few quick wins to pay attention to, especially early brands. Anyone can spin up a brand on social media. And so I think like turn it back on yourself. Like you see, like you get an ad for a shoe and you're like, oh, that's cute. You go over to the page and kind of the first question is this a real brand?
Yep.
And so then think, what are the validators that someone would be going through? The first is follower count. And then the second is, does anyone I know that I follow them? So even if it has 5,000 followers, but you see like one or two people that you like their vibe follows it, you're like, oh, they're real and somebody else I know. The third validator at a high level is, have you been covered before in Vogue or any magazine? So that in your bio, you can say, as seen in Vogue or whatever. And so those three things, I think for a new brand go a long way. You don't need all three, but like that is enough for the consumer to be like, this is a real entity. I'm going to give my money and get something back. And I think that is like kind of overlooked sometimes because we're so busy launching a brand that we don't think of like, oh, the consumer is going to even wonder if we're like actually not just a shell company for whatever. So those are the quick things that I see are often overlooked, are those quick validators.
Yeah. Do you think it's important for the founder to be the face of the company or at least present in a lot of the content?
As a founder or creator that doesn't love to be the face of something, I'd say it's not necessary, but it is important to show that there is a face. I think when someone's asking who is making this, or like who is behind this, having an answer on the website is the best way. I also, right, like any brand has finite time. New brands that are like one to few people show, there's like not tons of time to be producing all this content. So I think that is a balance. But finding the answer, like like let's say I see a brand and I see, oh, this founder looks like they have a good mission, but like they don't go too deep into the how they source their materials. Not like this other brand that has a whole report every year that they use. It doesn't mean that they are not doing it. It means like maybe they're also like really busy, and so using other validators to like answer that. So my way of saying it should have a face that helps us understand who's behind it, but does that person need to be front and center all over the Instagram? If they want to, if that's part of their strategy, but it doesn't need to be.
Yeah, I think it's a point of contention
Yeah.
for, for a lot of founders to be if especially if they hate making content. It's either they hate making content or there's no time.
Right. Well,
and someone has to be creating the content.
Someone has to be creating. And what's the product? Like, are you saying then that founder is also a product? Because then they're selling themselves to drive conversions. And if that person isn't good at being the product or wants to be the product, then that's not going to really help. So I would say like there's also other people that could be the face of or like one of the faces of the brand. I think that also goes into your long-term strategy. Are you is the brand your name? So then like really you are the only person, or are you trying to grow into something that other faces could represent that brand? I think if you look at Baboon to the Moon, I don't know the person's role, but like they have some like kind of kitschy brand tone of like, this is an ugly backpack or ugly color or something. I might be kind of, go look at it yourself. But it gets all these likes, and like that's not one of the founders. That's one of the people that create content, and yet she translates that vibe perfectly. So I think you could also do that, but just viewing that as another vehicle to communicating the brand.
Yeah, I've seen some brands over time, like they've even gone so far, if the founding team is like, we do not want to be on social creating content, like they've even approached other creators, maybe even a influencer or creator with a large following themselves, and offered equity to bring them on as the face. Is that something that you would kind of advise a brand to do if they were like, small team, small budget, what do I do?
Yeah, I've explored that in a few different iterations, and I would say that could be a possibility, but don't get too thirsty right away from that relationship. I'd say like find someone this could be a good fit. So do a few projects do a few collaborations and see. I think if we're talking about influencers, then the things I like to ask myself before going too deep is, what is that audience fatigue of that influencer? And so maybe they would be that perpetual brand face, and that's a longer term play. You still want to like do a few things to even see if you have the right chemistry as a team. But then also, sometimes I've worked with brands where there's like a few influencers, some have like 5,000 followers, some might have like 50,000. And we're like, oh my God, they're driving so many sales. This is amazing. We're going to like cut this whole deal and contract with them. And it's like, actually, that was the peak you'll ever get from them. And so that fatigue is real. So I think looking at that, there's a few different ways to approach it. But I would just say proceed with caution. And then if there's things that are working, ask yourself, is that sustainable? And then let's build a plan from there.
That's great advice. Yeah, like maybe starting with like a rev share agreement at the beginning, and like you said, like make sure the chemistry is there, and that it is like a sustainable marketing play long term.
Right. And then that takeaway could be, especially if like, not that everyone's always talking to investors, but sometimes I like to ask myself that of like, I'm making this decision. How would I justify that to investors? What's the reason behind it? And so from for me, I'd be like, oh, we found this person. They were sick. They drove X. So if you have your real or pretend investors in the back of your mind and they say, oh, justifying what your strategy is from there, you find this influencer and you're like, we're going to go deep with this person, formalize a contract, 6-month contract, whatever. Realizing that if you have a strategy behind that, that's great, but also why not just keep it steady state of what you have and maybe have some incentive structures along the way that could have both parties win if there's an upside? Or you'd say, hey, that person was great for us. Let's work on finding more people that fill that, but also might kind of have different angles in for different audiences. So that person really attracted the vegan audience and did X, but we also know that park lovers, whatever. So we're finding kind of that archetype of influencer and seeing what sticks to expand that and scale that program without over-indexing on one entity. The other thing I wanted to share is I did find this one campaign once that was really effective for a founder. And granted, this founder is a little bit of the face of the brand, but I think one of the most effective campaigns that we did together was an SMS campaign, kind of like an Ask Me Anything. And we did that. So one, it drove people to sign up for SMS, and it was like, hey, text so-and-so anytime today to ask your questions. And we did it with other and people that represented the brand that serve different purposes. Without giving too much away, it's like, oh, let's say it might be you want legal advice, and this is a brand that helps provide that software, whatever. Then you have a team of lawyers. You're like, hey, you could like text them today and ask them anything for like low stakes, right? Just whatever. That is giving someone a direct channel to somebody that they might really need or want. And so we did that strategy, and it like totally increased SMS signups, but it was also because there's a direct like value exchange there. And those people and the founder and then those other people acted as the face of the brand without being that traditional person that we think of. It's like, oh, you're not the face of the brand unless you also have your own social media presence and blah, blah, blah. It's like, sure, but those could also be vanity metrics. Like if you are delivering core value to the highest propensity customers and like strengthening that community, then that is like incredible and priceless. And so ways you can do that don't always manifest into like, oh, the reel that got 2 million views and you're like, that's sick, but it's like a week later, will anyone remember that?
Right.
You should definitely still have those reels, but augmenting it for sure.
Yeah. Well, if a brand, let's talk about just like kind of general advice for startups. Like, what would you say if someone wanted to launch a fashion brand, especially with sustainability or other like key cultural values in mind, with a small team and limited resources? Like, what are some of your top level advice, like right out of the gate?
Yeah. We have asked this question a lot, especially brands that are, if you want to say mission driven, which implies that like other ones aren't, which is funny and sad. But that's always like the balance of how much do we focus on talking about the mission and the work that we do versus other things. And I think the way we've kind of learned to approach it is people are likely not to buy if it doesn't meet their aesthetic or their need, right? So you'll get that first purchase. Sorry, let me say that again. People are likely to not make the purchase unless it meets their aesthetic. So that has to hit a certain baseline of like, oh, I like this. If a brand focuses on the mission or the, goodwill of what they're doing, a consumer might buy into it, but if it doesn't truly hit their aesthetic bar or even quality bar, they will not become a repeat customer.
Definitely.
And so we say, make sure the product is sound, make sure the aesthetic aligns with a healthy TAM, total available market, like who's into it. Do not downplay that aesthetic or the quality. Like that needs to be the kind of I wouldn't say primary message all the time, but it needs to be a present message all the time that people can check that box in their mind and then use the amazing things that the brand does in different iterations or different campaigns, have it manifest in different ways where people are like, oh, I don't just like love what this product is, what this shirt is, but I like am obsessed with what they do and I will continue to advocate for them. I'll continue to buy more and build that trust there. And so that's kind of a way of saying it's always a balance, and the messages within the values driven part are balanced and threaded in that showcase the aesthetic and quality.
Yeah. That's really good advice. If a brand wanted to pitch the Majority Group, what would be the best way for them to approach you?
Oh, good question. Well, we do get a lot of DMs and sometimes emails. And people are like, check us out. And I do. So that would be like totally fine to do. But I think if a brand is really interested, I'd say like think of what your direct ask is, and lead with that. So it's a little bit clearer, because sometimes it's like, what do you actually want from us? And I think if you can answer that helps understand if we are a good fit to like have a conversation.
Yeah, and what materials should they have ready, if you are interested? Like, how can they be the most prepared for that meeting?
Yeah, I think knowing them, what they know about themselves and their brand and their goals, and then also knowing what they want to do with it and the gaps that they want to fill. I'd say materials are great. If we were to like move further in a process, there's typically a pitch deck if we're talking investment, or even a Google Doc. We've done it. Those are standard. We've done it different ways also. But I think before someone were to like, oh, Majority Group, let me make a deck, it's like first conversation, know yourself and know what you're looking for. So then we can have that conversation around, are we even the right fit for each other, and go from there. But that said, there is someone that we're working with right now that it's interesting. We're rooted in fashion, have done a few like CPG. We've invested in Diaspora Co., a spice company, which we're obsessed with. But we've also evaluated a few film companies now, making videos and things, which is interesting how that's made it foray. But anyway, we're talking to one now that's never done investment. They don't know where to start. And we've had early days conversations. And I'm like, do you want help with your pitch deck? And so that's a way of like, we've seen a lot of pitch decks now. Me in my tech career, I've created too many of them. And so that is the best way for us to provide value to this company at this standpoint, is helping them craft their message and go from there. And so, there's like the fake it till you make it, but there's also like ask for help. Like,
Yeah.
People want to help, especially if something is, they help believe in it. And so that's a good way to show support.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a great place to end. Thank you so much, Lola. This was awesome.
Yeah, thank you.